What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. For those of you watching for the first time, I work in China in an executive role. I'm a lawyer by training, but I went to Beijing to study Chinese foreign policy, and in my current role, part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of the country, and I put these videos together here for my mates back home who were interested in China. They said you should throw that stuff up on YouTube, and that's what I've been doing for a few months now. If that is something you might be interested in, maybe consider subscribing. For everybody else, how the hell are you? I hope you're staying safe and you're good wherever you are. This week, of course, in China was Dragon Boat Festival, so it has been a slow news week in terms of domestic stories, policy papers, economic updates, but there have been some major developments in some of China's bilateral relationships, particularly with a few countries that they've had a ongoing diplomatic row with. And so this is going to be a very diplomatic, international relations heavy sort of episode. The last couple of days of this week, I didn't have to go into work. Everything is so crazy in the world at the moment. So with the holiday, I took the advantage to take a high-speed rail over to Shanghai. I rented a lovely villa in the French concession area, and I just relaxed. I had European cuisine every day. I binge watched The Sopranos, and then kept an eye on a couple of policy updates that were being released every evening. So I'm feeling nice and refreshed, relaxed. I hope you guys are all doing well. Before we jump onto the main stories, there's a couple of small little updates that I want to touch on, and then we're going to jump into the main course. Now, the first mini update is that China has been experiencing destructive rainfall and flooding this week, including where I live in Hangzhou. It's reported this week that the southwestern megacity of Chongqing has experienced its worst floods in over 2 decades, with over 100,000 people already being evacuated from some districts. As of the filming of this, total cost of flooding damage has already passed $3 billion US, so it's well on the way to being the second most expensive weather disaster so far this year. It's sitting pretty on third at the moment, but it's likely going to hit #2 within the next few days. Now, if the flooding worsens, if there are any other developments on the flooding situation, there will be a full story on it next week. But as of the filming of this, it's not sufficiently important enough to give it its own full story and full analysis, but it's worth keeping an eye on. The other thing I wanted to discuss before we jump into the main stuff is an update with the China-India tensions. Of course, we discussed this in detail last week. We also had 2 previous episodes when we talked about the tensions before it exploded with the killings the Monday evening before last. The situation as we film this is that it looks like it may be de-escalating. However, there are mixed signals, as some articles and sources suggest that both sides, though they're outwardly saying the right things diplomatically, there is evidence that both sides may be digging in at the border, and that there is still a chance that there will be an accident or some sort of escalation. So we're keeping an eye on that at the moment, but I'm not going to give it a full story this week either, because there hasn't really been much new. If you are interested in the longer term fallout from the bilateral relationship, I would recommend that you hit up last week's episode, where I do provide some analysis and we look at what certain experts are saying on that topic. Last week I said that this event could push India and the US closer together, though since that episode several Chinese scholars have written over the last week that China and India can stabilize relations and implement better methods to deal with border tensions in the future, and that it is premature to say this incident will result in closer India-US ties. So on this point, I still stand by my analysis from last week's episode, despite some top scholars from the People's Republic disagreeing with me, and other scholars from overseas. I guess at this point, only time will tell. If there is an escalation or an important development that I think you guys need to know about, I will include it in a future episode. Okay, those were the mini updates. Let's jump into the main stuff this week on China Update. Okay, first up, let's talk about Hong Kong and talk about some of the updates we've seen over the last week with the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region, and particularly with the controversial national security law that was, of course, passed by the National People's Congress at the 全国两会, the National 2 meetings a few weeks ago. Now, the standing committee of the National People's Congress, not to be confused with the National People's Congress, deliberated on the draft of the controversial national security law for the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region on June 18 through 20. That was their 3-day meeting then, and it will likely deliberate again on the draft before the end of the month. And it could well be that the controversial law is passed into law on the 1st of July to mark the anniversary of the handing over of Hong Kong from the British to the People's Republic of China. Now, the Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post provided key new information about the law over the last weekend onto Monday, including the Hong Kong government should strengthen its efforts to monitor and manage schools and societies where national security is involved. Hong Kong government will set up a commission to safeguard national security, which will be chaired by the chief executive and include an advisor appointed by Beijing. The Hong Kong leader is to appoint designated judges to preside over cases. Although on this point on Tuesday, Ms. Lam said that as chief executive, she would appoint these judges based on the advice of a judicial body like all judges. On Tuesday too, the Hong Kong Bar Association criticized this point, saying enabling the Special Administrative Region leader to designate judges to preside over trials for these cases would undermine judicial independence. And the final point, the new law will override local legislation should conflicts arise. Incredibly, Chief Executive Lam admitted at a press conference on Wednesday that she had, quote, not seen the complete details of the proposed legislation, end quote, even though it could well be implemented within the next week or so. On Wednesday, Zhang Yong, Vice Chairman of the Legislative Affairs Commission of the National People's Congress Standing Committee, seems to have indicated that foreign judges will not be permitted to hear cases brought under the national security law. Now, though this has been suspected for some time, it actually contradicts what Carrie Lam had said the previous day in a press conference when she said there would be no nationality restrictions on judges assigned to national security cases. Now, on this point, before we move on, we may actually already be seeing the self-censoring or the cooling effects of this legislation, of this rules change, with the organizer of the annual Hong Kong Book Fair this week advising exhibitors to exercise, quote, self-discipline, end quote, and avoid selling, quote unquote, unlawful books at this year's event. Unlawful here meaning through the operation of the national security law. Now, next up, I want to talk about quite an important report. We sort of know about this theme of the aging society in China and the sort of policy, social, political, economic challenges it is going to present the country. But this week, an important report was released calling for, among other things, pension reform, and warning policymakers about some of the major challenges that are in store for China as the society ages. So the China Development Research Foundation, which is an organization affiliated with the State Council's Research Development Center, which is a top policy center within the central government in China, released a report last week stressing the need to fully remove all restrictions on family planning, comprehensively reform the pension system, and boost economic productivity. The report found that the falling birth rate and shrinking workforce will make it increasingly difficult for the economy to support the rapidly growing number of retirees that China is going to see in the medium to long term. It concluded that China's population aged 65 and over is estimated to rise to about 114 million, about 22% of the population by 2035, so in 15 years, from the 180 million approximately, or 12% of the population that China now has in 2020. By 2050, almost 1/3 of the country will be older than 65 years of age. Chinese non-state media actor Caixin Media reports China currently doesn't have a national pension system. Rather, each provincial level government has its own pension, healthcare, unemployment, occupational injury, and housing funds. Contributions come from individuals, enterprises, and local government. However, in some provinces, pension funds are running huge deficits. It was also reported that Zhou Xiaochun, the former governor of the Central Bank of China, warned earlier this year that China's aging population has become an increasingly pressing problem, an increasing acute problem that policymakers need to face, and he put forward 4 policy proposals to improve the stability of the pension system, including raising the retirement age, which currently is lower than most developed economies, and incentivizing workers to increase their pension savings. However, he admits that there still needs to be much more done, and this is again an acute issue for policymakers over the next couple of decades. Okay, next up, let's talk about the Beijing outbreak. We talked about this in depth last week, but there are a few updates we should touch on this week. After all, this is an outbreak in the capital, so it's a politically important center, and this has probably spooked a lot of officials in the country. So this week there is still approximately a dozen new official cases a day in the capital, with almost all of the new cases being found in the relatively poorer areas of Fengtai and Daxing, but the situation seems to be coming under control. Now, Zhang Xiaofan, director of the Beijing CDC, expressed concern at a press conference on Tuesday after the discovery of a food delivery person coming down with the virus. These drivers, who are colloquially referred to as 外卖drivers, deliver hundreds of meals per day. Testing capacity in the capital is up, with the Beijing government announcing on Monday that they have conducted nucleic acid tests on more than 2 million people over the previous 10 days, and they now have the capacity to do 300,000 tests per day in the capital alone. Now, you may remember last week I was talking about how local officials in the city said that they had identified over 200,000 people of interest in the city who had been near outbreak sites, particularly the center of this current outbreak in Beijing at the Xinfadi market in Fengtai. And I said at that time last week that it was incredible and frankly quite terrifying that the government had been able to identify so many people with that level of precision within a couple of days. Now we have a bit of an update as to how they did that this week, with the state-run Xinhua media reporting this week that Beijing district officials confirmed that they are using data from mobile phone carriers to track individual movement. One final point before we move on the virus situation generally in China after Beijing. The government's priority is stopping imported cases. The borders remain closed to foreigners, and even Chinese citizens are having difficulty coming into the country, with some turning to truly desperate measures. On Tuesday, the South China Morning Post reports that Chinese citizens in Russia are forging fake COVID tests in order to board planes back to China. Okay, next up is the first of several stories we need to look at this week on either diplomatic rows between a bilateral relationship or a development within a particularly important bilateral relationship. First up, we're going to talk about the EU and China. So the EU-China summit took place via video link on Monday. The event included some frank exchanges in telling language, and in the end, the EU and China could not agree on a joint statement. In fact, the EU statement was very telling, with European Council President Michel saying, quote, "EU-China relations have evolved in recent years. Our economic interdependency is high, and we must work together on global challenges like climate action, meeting the Sustainable Development Goals, or dealing with COVID-19. Engaging and cooperating with China is both an opportunity and a necessity. But at the same time, we have to recognize that we do not share the same values, political systems, or approach to multilateralism. We will engage in a clear-eyed and confident way, robustly defending EU interests and standing firm on our values," end quote. Now, we've discussed the increasing use of the word values in EU statements, and the Chinese have noticed this as well. Wang Yiwei, director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University in Beijing, articulated a view that I've seen by other scholars and within the mainstream state media in China. Quote, "It was predictable that Europe voiced these concerns, values, as even before the summit, some politicians issued a series of statements opposing China's stance for echoing the domestic needs from a political aspect while taking US pressure into account," end quote. Now, we've seen this idea in the context of other diplomatic disputes, where that is that when a country is in a dispute with China, it is because it has given into US pressure in some way and that they are controlled by Washington. I think it would be a mistake for Beijing policymakers to assess that China's various diplomatic disputes and challenges at the moment are the results exclusively or in large part to US pressure. without reflecting on whether aspects of the disputes are due to indigenous local frustrations with Chinese state behavior. On this point, we'll be looking at the Canadian and Australian diplomatic disputes shortly. European Commission President von der Leyen said, quote, "The COVID pandemic and a number of major bilateral and multilateral challenges show clearly the EU-China partnership is critical. It is in terms of trade, climate, technology, and the defense of multilateralism. But for our relations to develop further, they must become more rules-based and reciprocal in order to achieve a real level playing field." End quote. Now, we're increasingly seeing the word reciprocity also being used by EU leaders, and this is an important development and something we need to keep an eye on. It suggests that there is an increasing consensus that the EU should demand that its companies be treated in China the same way that Chinese companies are treated in the EU. Like I said last time, it's interesting to note that the US also used this sort of language in the lead up to the trade war, and a lot of it initially came from US companies operating or trying to operate in the People's Republic of China. I would hear that word often when I sat in on, for example, US Chamber of Commerce meetings that were being held in Beijing months leading up to the trade war. On this point as well, there have also been calls in Europe to pull its supply chain from China, something that we've been discussing on this program for the last month or so. If China would not accept the principle of reciprocity, then the European Union should in exchange start to cut off their production line with China. China will actually pay a price that could be quite high if European companies and European politicians start to discuss how to move production away from China, how to locate companies in more stable and reliable countries in Asia or Eastern Europe. On the topic of bilateral relations with major powers, I want to have a couple of quick updates in relation to China's relationship to the United States. So at the beginning of the week, Trump defended the Phase 1 trade agreement by a tweet after an advisor, Peter Navarro, appeared on Fox News appearing to indicate that the deal was over. So it looks like the president is still defending the Phase 1 trade agreement. On Monday, the US announced that it would be treating 4 major Chinese media outlets, all of which are directly or indirectly controlled by the party in China, as foreign emissaries, and as such, special restrictions will apply to these media outlets. This is part of a journalistic/propaganda tit-for-tat between the United States and China, which started back in February and which we covered back then. So go back and look at February's episodes if you're interested in how this journalistic tit-for-tat started, and a little bit of analysis that we provided at that time. China's foreign ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian called the decision, quote, "another naked US political suppression of Chinese media," end quote, and that it, quote, "exposed US hypocrisy in the so-called freedom of the press and speech," end quote. On Tuesday, the National Institute for South China Sea Studies in Beijing published a piece titled "The US Military Presence in the Asia-Pacific 2020, in which the Chinese Institute argued that the idea that China is militarizing the South China Sea is sensationalized American fiction, and accused the US of being the biggest threat to peace in the region. Okay guys, 2 more diplomatic stories to go, both middle power Anglophone countries. I'm sure you've been following issues that Canada and Australia have been having with their bilateral relations with Beijing over the last few months. 2 Canadian citizens detained after the arrest of Huawei executive Ms. Meng were formally charged with crimes this week. Mr. Kovrig was charged with spying on national secrets and intelligence for entities outside the territory of China, and Mr. Spavor was charged with spying on national secrets for illegally providing state secrets to entities outside the territory of China as well. Those are the formal names of the charges. So these 2 Canadian citizens have been charged with espionage. Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau maintains that the arrests were, quote, arbitrary detentions, end quote, saying to journalists this week, quote, "It has been obvious from the beginning that this was a political decision made by the Chinese government, and we deplore it, and we have from the very beginning," end quote. The People's Republic of China rejects this, of course, and a ministry spokesperson from the foreign ministry, again, Zhao Lijian, said to reporters the next day, quote, There is no such thing as arbitrary detention. Going on to say, China urges the relevant Canadian leader, here referring to Trudeau, to earnestly respect the spirit of the rule of law, respect China's judicial sovereignty, and stop making irresponsible remarks. End quote. Now, not everyone was as diplomatic as Mr. Zhao and some of their statements on the matter, with state-run China Daily EU Bureau Chief Chen Weihua tweeting over last weekend, quote, "People often fail to note that Meng is worth 10 Kovrig and Spavor, if not more." They're saying that Ms. Meng is worth at least 10 times more than these two Canadian citizens are. It's interesting that he says this, considering that Beijing's official position is that the arrest of these two Canadians are in no way connected to Ms. Meng and her trial in Canada. Mr. Chen later said that his views are entirely his own and do not reflect either that of the paper, which he's the editor of, or the Chinese government. Several nations have joined Canada's call for immediate consular access to the two citizens in accordance with the Vienna Convention. Okay, last one for today. Let's talk about Australia and China. As you guys who watch me know, China and Australia are in the middle of a bitter diplomatic row, which intensified with Beijing implementing what are in fact economic sanctions against a variety of Australian exports after Canberra called for an international inquiry into the origins of the COVID pandemic. This isn't the first diplomatic row between these two countries. In fact, there have been several major ones over the last few years that resulted in an economic response from the Chinese side. Now it seems that Beijing's behavior has taken a toll on Australian public opinion. This week, the Lowy Institute of Australia released its annual polling research, and the results were very interesting indeed, finding that 1 in 4 Australians no longer trust China to do the right thing in world affairs, down 29% in just 2 years, so it's been cut almost in half. Confidence in China's President Xi Jinping has also dropped down to 22% of Australians, with 94% of respondents saying that Australia should reduce its economic dependence on China. 94% believe that Australia is too economically reliant on China. The poll also found that 8 in 10 Australians would be in favour of travel or financial sanctions on Chinese officials associated with human rights abuses. Now, in response to this polling suggesting a massive deterioration in Australian public opinion towards China and its leadership, Chinese state media and senior foreign ministry spokesperson Chun Yinghua said that the deterioration was primarily due to American-led anti-Chinese propaganda, which pushes an quote-unquote ideological bias. With this level of Australian public opinion supporting the Prime Minister's hardening line with China, the Australian government will have more political room to push back against foreign interference attempts and weather the effects of further economic sanctions, which may still come. Okay guys, that's our episode of China Update. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or any comments on the news this week or my analysis, please put them below. It's always great to hear from you guys. I always appreciate it. Apart from that though, I hope you guys are staying safe wherever you are, and I will see you all next week on China Update.